welcome back. This is part two of the video series discussing the sample literature review with you. So what I'm going to do is just pick up with the end of the body paragraph that I was discussing at the end of the first video that I recorded. So thus, according to Alexander and Link, any contact with the mentally ill is associated with reduced fear and rejection. However, since this study was observational in nature, we cannot know if contact reduces fear or having lower fear increase contact. This is really important because what the author is doing here is she's acknowledging that there is a limitation in the study, that there's a potential complication of the study. So what she's saying here is that because of the method that was used and the fact that it was observational, it's possible that the result that the researcher or researchers were finding may or may not be the cause or the actual ending, the actual finding. So you want to make sure whenever you're writing a literature review that you're not only telling the reader what we know from the research, but also what we don't know or what's sort of questionable from the research. So it's really important that when you're reading your sources, you read them critically and you account for the methods that were used. Every method is always going to have some kind of limitation to it. So if they were doing interviews, for example, interviews are much more time intensive, so you tend to have smaller samples of people versus if you're using a survey. You want to consider the sample that was used. So is there only one race or one gender or one age group that's represented, and the author or authors are trying to make broad claims from their study. So you really want to have a critical eye when you're going through your resources, because it's important that you note that kind of information in your literature review, because otherwise you're really only giving your reader a partial understanding of the research. And it's definitely important that you communicate any kind of limitations that could potentially affect the findings and thus skew our understanding of the topic. So the next body paragraph: Corrigan, Rowan, Green, London, River, Uphoff, Wasowski, White, and Kubiak conducted 2 studies examining the causal processes in contact, fear, and rejection. So you notice that in contrast to earlier topic sentence, this is specific to one source, which means that the reader will anticipate you will only discuss this one source here. And if you were to try to discuss other sources, that could create some organizational problems. So we know that this article apparently is going to include discussion about 2 studies rather than just one. And sometimes you'll come across research that condenses multiple studies together, and then other times it's limited to just one. So we know this was from 2002. For us now, that's kind of outdated, but at the time that this was written, I think this was 2009 or something like that, it would have been a little bit more current and up to date. Corrigan et al., and notice the use of et al., which basically means others, and depending on what source you consult, you'll find different guidelines regarding when you can use et al. So some sources will tell you if there are 5 or more authors, you can use et al. Some will tell you if there are 6 or more authors, use et al. So my suggestion is to use the guideline that you see on the Purdue OWL APA Formatting and Style Guide site, or if you are using a handbook, then to follow that, and you might just want to make a note for me of what you're using, okay? Because otherwise I'm going to go by the Purdue site, because that's something that I know everyone has access to, and not everyone necessarily has the handbook, a writer's reference, or a handbook. So Corrigan et al. Posited 2 models, and posited just means, sort of proposed 2 models to account for stigmatizing reactions. So we're getting a little bit of background information on their research. In the first model, labeled personal responsibility, beliefs about personality responsibility influences both the level of pity and anger displayed toward mental patients. So you see how this author, Susie Student, is really careful to define this for us, because this is a model that was being proposed in this study. So if the reader doesn't know that study, then he or she isn't going to understand this terminology. So it's really important to define that. Additionally, the variables of pity and anger influence helping behavior. So again, we're getting a little bit more explanation here. In the second model, labeled dangerousness, perceived dangerousness influences fear of mental patients, which in turn influences the avoidance of the mentally ill. So again, just making sure to define that jargon, that technical language that only an insider or someone familiar with the source will know. All right, so now we're going to get into more of the actual heart of the study, because this is just sort of foundational, base, fundamental information that the reader needs to be familiar with in order to understand the findings, presumably. In their first study, because again, remember that there were 2, Corrigan et al. Administered a questionnaire to 216 community college students. So see how the author is careful to tell us what the pool of participants was. We know it was 216 community college students. That doesn't tell us, everything about the participants, but at least we do have some understanding of the scope of the study. This questionnaire contained items which would allow the examination of the two models. Okay, so it would be helpful to see this questionnaire, or a critical reader more than likely is going to want to at least see some sample questions from the questionnaire. Typically what you would see, depending on the length of the questionnaire, is there may be an appendix at the end of the paper that has the full questionnaire in it, or sometimes you'll see where there's a link in an article or an essay that takes you to a site that has the full questionnaire. All right. The results of a path analysis, and this terminology may or may not be familiar to the reader. It depends on what their research methodology background is. Keep in mind, though, that if you're ever reading a document and they refer to terminology like this, more than likely you can do a Google search for it, and there's probably going to be a Wikipedia page. So you don't have to be an expert in research methods in order to understand the research that you're reading, okay? There's nothing wrong with Googling terms that you don't recognize, don't understand. I do it all the time, so there's no shame in that. The results of a path analysis indicated that while both models fit the data, and one thing I do want to note here, remember that data is plural, okay? So if you use the word data, remember it's plural. Datum is the singular form, D-A-T-U-M. So if you use data, it's plural. The results for the dangerousness model seem far more consistent with the data. Okay, now, one thing that is problematic here is your reader has no clear understanding what far more consistent means, okay? So a critical reader is going to say, well, this is really vague. It doesn't tell me a whole lot. I know that according to your interpretation, or according to potentially what Corrigan et al. Are saying, the results are far more consistent. But readers tend to like numbers, especially when we're talking about data and we're talking about research studies. So if you're going to say that something is far more consistent, or especially if you're going to report a finding that supposedly is significant or statistically significant, that's a major buzzword in research, you want to provide more specific, detailed information to demonstrate that, because otherwise your reader is going to be a little bit critical of this and a little bit cautious about accepting this because they don't really know the specifics. Their second study, and see how we're already segueing into the second study, so really we want more information about this first study here. Their second study was an attempt to manipulate variables in the models. Participants met with either an educational group or with a mental patient. During the meetings, myths about the personality responsibility or the dangerousness of mental patients were discussed and debunked. While education yielded some positive results regarding fear and rejection, contact with mental patients produced stronger results. Again, what are stronger results? What are some positive results? Thus, Corrigan et al. Demonstrated that contact causes less rejection and fear. Again, a critical reader is going to look at this and say, well, I know some of the fundamentals of this research, of these two studies that were done and that were reported, but I don't have any numbers to really explain to me what the findings were. So if I were reading this paper, I would be much less likely to accept this conclusion and to accept these findings, because I have no real hard, concrete evidence that I can refer to. For a reader, the only option would be to either just blindly accept this, or to have to go and consult the Corrigan et al. Source, himself or herself. And a reader shouldn't have to do that, okay? Especially when you consider the purpose of a literature review, which again is to inform the reader of the current state of the research. So let's move then to the next body paragraph. Right, stigmatization of the mentally ill is caused by the public's belief in myths about the dangerousness of the mentally ill, and exposing those myths can reduce stigmatization. So if you remember the wording from the introduction, this is clearly harking back to that. So, the author is clearly paying attention to what her focus is and trying to maintain that cohesiveness between the thesis statement and the body content. Okay. Right. At least 1/3 of the people sampled in one study, and this is really problematic to just say one study, and it begs the question of why the author doesn't just say at least 1/3 of the people sampled in Martin's study or something like that. Why say just one study? So that they would both reject socially and fear violence from someone displaying behaviors associated with different mentally illnesses. Okay, that is a typo. I'm not just reading that wrong. So it should be different mental illnesses. If you remember from the first video, one thing I told you is that we didn't have a clear understanding of how many participants there were in the study. So in this case, we know at least 1/3, which, why is it at least 1/3? We would expect to have a more specific number than that. But then also, we don't know how many people were sampled in this study. So are we talking about a sample of 50 people? Are we talking about a sample of 5,000 people? So this is really problematic. And again, a critical reader is going to look at this and say, I have no idea how many people were sampled, so you telling me that only 1/3 of the people sampled said this doesn't really convince me or persuade me of very much. So again, I'm not telling you that you have to provide all of the details of the research that you cite and that you synthesize, but you need to keep these things in mind. If you're going to report a finding that says at least 1/3 or 20%, your reader really needs to know what the sample size is, what that pool is of participants, to have a clear grasp of the significance of that number, because otherwise your reader is much more likely to just dismiss the claims that are being made. Other research, and again, it's unclear why there is such ambiguity surrounding the studies that this student or Susie student is talking about. I'm not sure why we have ambiguous references to one study and other research, and that's something I would discourage you from doing. Just specify the studies. You have to cite them in your bibliography, and specifying the studies, to me, it reads a lot better, it's a lot more specific, and it enables your reader to go and consult those studies without having to guess which ones in the bibliography are the ones that are being talked about here. All right, so other research discovered that this rejection is associated to, rather than it should be associated with, lack of contact with the mentally ill, and that as contact increased, fear of the mentally ill decreased. Okay. The direction of the relationship between fear and rejection seems to be that fear, possibly based upon myths about mental illness, causes rejection. So one thing that is good about this is that she is including this qualifier possibly, so she's not trying to say that for sure myths about mental illness lead to this relationship, and that's really important because you'll notice when you're reading sources that often researchers are very, very careful to include qualifiers, like in some cases, maybe, often, frequently, rather than trying to make a blanket statement that applies in all circumstances. So you also want to keep that in your writing. So you want to make sure that you are accurately representing what researchers are claiming in their studies, but that you also are very, very careful to qualify any claims that you're trying to make when you're setting up any potential argument or any kind of claim that you're trying to use to convince your reader of a certain belief. Okay. Taken as a whole, it appears that exposing these myths as myths increases the acceptance of the mentally ill, and that staged contact with a mentally person, I think that should be mentally ill person, to expose myths has an even more powerful effect. Okay. And again, a critical reader may say they want more sources than what have been provided so far and that are being taken as a whole here to make this claim. But this really depends on the number of sources that you're asked to include. So, if you're only asked to have 6 sources, it's really not fair to expect you to have 15 in there. So my advice is when you're selecting your sources, make sure that you're getting sources that work well together in your literature review and that give you the sufficient information that you need to support any kind of claims that you are going to make. All right, caution must be advised, though, and again, see that semicolon usage. Martin et al.'s and Alexander and Link studies and the first study of Corrigan et al. Were based upon paper and pencil methodologies, and while Corrigan et al.'s second study involved stage presentations, it was conducted in a college setting with a college sample. All right, so again, we're getting acknowledgement of possible limitations that could have skewed the results, although it may be useful to have more information about why a paper and pencil methodology is problematic. Okay. Future research should replicate these findings in more natural settings with different populations. So this paragraph is kind of interesting because it seems to be a conclusion, given that there's no other paragraph here. And certainly this last sentence reads like it would be in a conclusion. But then part of this reads like a body paragraph, so it's almost like it becomes a hybrid body paragraph conclusion. And when your reader is coming across this statement here, it could read like it's a summary sentence that's supposed to recap the earlier content of the paper, or it could read like it's setting up another body paragraph. So I think it's really best if you can make it clear that you are segueing into the conclusion, and also if the content of the conclusion can be confused as being part of a body paragraph. And then we just have our references page, which again, when you're using APA style, the bibliography is titled references. Remember, bibliography, that just means it's a list of citations, okay? And you can see the format that's following APA style, okay, certain features here.